Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and I'm so pleased to be able to now present to you session 3 of the Forum on the Reserved Presidential Election. As promised, we said that we will feature 2 members of the 4G leadership of Singapore, clearly political leaders who will be integral to how Singapore shapes up not just today, but over the next 20, 30 years. They are all part of the class of 2011, became MPs in the parliamentary elections of May 2011. We're very pleased to have Minister Chun Singh, Minister in the Prime Minister's office. He is in a unique position because he's also Secretary General of the National Trades Union Congress, which means he has exposure to many people on the ground, workers, as well as some, I think, interaction with employers. And not only that, he is the deputy head of the People's Association, which then means that he has yet another level of exposure to ordinary Singaporeans, people in in our communities. So we're really very pleased that he agreed to join us this afternoon and just share with us, his thoughts of what's happening on the ground and, what are the broader implications of having this special reserved presidential election. And then on my left, again, I'm very, very pleased to have this opportunity to share the platform again with you, SMS, Janil Puthucheary. SMS is in the Ministry of Communications and Information, but I don't know how many of you know that he heads up an organization that's called onepeople.sg. And as Minister Shanmugam shared in session 1, we have something called self-help groups, but we know that over the years, the self-help groups have found ways to work together as well. And one of the efforts that was a joint product of their, kind of coming together in collaboration is onepeople.sg. It's an association that looks at race, religion, issues of social cohesion in Singapore. And so we're very pleased that he is here to really discuss his ideas, his vision for the future of multiracialism in Singapore. So with that, I think SMS actually volunteered to offer us some opening remarks. I think it'll take about 10 minutes. And then from there, we will go into our Q&A session. And then I think Minister Chan has volunteered to wrap up towards the end when we are maybe 10 minutes before time. So in between is where you fire up, you ask your questions, so get ready. First, over to SMS Janil Puthucheary.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Just apropos your last few comments, we have a very unique model of multiracialism here in Singapore. We also have a fairly singular model of volunteerism. So when you say I volunteered, I think everybody in the room knows what that means. The issue at hand, the reserved presidential election, is something that I engaged with on a number of levels quite robustly. It's a polite way of saying I had a lot of arguments with a lot of people, many of whom actually I see as familiar faces in this room. So I know that the rest of the session will certainly be interesting and engaging. When I first heard about the proposal for the constitutional amendment, my initial reaction, I suspect, like many people, was a very negative one. This was a very visceral, top-line idea that we were going to introduce a racial categorization where one had not been present before. And as we were debating this at OPSG, onepeople.sg, and several other forums, on the face of it, it starts off with the premise that this is something negative, perhaps something regressive, a step backwards. So I can appreciate when people start their questions or debate with me about this matter on that footing, because that is certainly the initial sense that I had. Clearly, I don't feel that way anymore, which is why I volunteered to be on this panel. it was a journey that required quite a lot of understanding of the minutiae. It's one of those things where I think in order for me to have changed my mind, I really had to understand the details. I'm not legally trained. But really getting to grips with the minutiae of exactly what was being proposed and what was not being excluded as a way forward. It, I think, is a necessary step. I believe that without it, our model of multiculturalism, our model of multiracialism, the model of social development that we wish to pursue and we have wanted to pursue for the last 52 years will be weakened. Despite the initial misgivings, I believe it is an opportunity to strengthen that model and take us forward. But as I say, I fully appreciate that there have been lots of arguments that I've been engaged with in this, and I expect we'll have many more today. I think the fact that we are arguing about it still, it demonstrates to us the centrality of race in that social narrative that we're trying to create as part of our national identity. I think if an issue like this was brought up, announced, passed without comment, it'd be a fairly sad reflection on the society that we are. So I'm glad that we've had a very robust, very engaging discourse. And in some respects, I am glad that it continues, that people still care about making this work properly. Because if we can't defend this, then we need to reconsider it. And something as central as ethnic identity, racial identity to our national consciousness, we will have to keep on defending it every year, every time, every law, every constitutional amendment, every time this comes up in part of our discourse, we need to be able to defend the position that we have. So I think the interest is certainly very useful. It will allow us to be a nation that keeps on thinking about what it means to have that national identity and what role race plays in it. As for the election process itself, I'm convinced by the mechanisms, the specific changes, that it will strengthen our model. And very importantly, I feel that it does not in any way exclude completely any path for a community to define itself over time, for a racial identity to alter over time, and for our stance to change as a nation over time. And I think that last bit especially, if we take a position that we need to make a decision which is binding for all time, I think it will weaken us gradually as people lose the sense that they have a role to play in strengthening that identity. So I'll stop there. I'm sure that we'll have lots and lots of interesting questions, and I'll look forward to an engaging, robust debate with a minimum number of euphemisms about volunteerism and politeness otherwise.
Thank you, SMS. Maybe I can just quickly kick off by posing two quick questions to SMS and Minister. The first one is that I think in the last session, this is just a technical question, it was raised that a presidential election should be held, no less than 3 months before the end of the term of a president. Minister Chan, are you able to sort of help us, on that issue alone? I mean, just that one, quick one.
Okay, I think this, good afternoon everyone. I think this is just a point of clarification because I was seated at the back just now listening to the conversation.
Yes.
What the Constitution says, and I'll explain to you the reason why the Constitution is such, is that it says that the government of the day cannot hold an election for us. When there's a sitting president, you cannot hold an election more than 3 months before the expiry of the presidential term. Now, why is that so? That's when you have a sitting president. If the president, for whatever reason, passes on due to health and whatnot, then you have to hold an election within 6 months. But if there's a sitting president, healthy, doing his job, you can't hold an election more than 3 months before the expiry of the term. And that is for a very simple reason. That is to prevent the government of the day from turfing out a president prematurely, if you like. Okay? Because otherwise you can have a situation whereby 1 year ahead of the end of the presidential term, the government decides to call an election and make the sitting president a lame duck. Okay, so that's the first point of clarification. It is not that you must hold it within 3 months from the end of the term. It is you cannot hold it more than 3 months before the end of the term. So you can check that legally. Now, the second thing that I heard is that, so is it unconstitutional that we now have an election after the end of term? Yes. Now, I was the one who went to Parliament to seek Parliament's endorsement and support for us to hold this particular election after the end of the expiry of the previous presidential term. And I gave the reason very simply that we wanted the presidential campaign to deconflict with the National Day festivities. Because in the month of August, we always have our National Parade, National Day rally, and so forth. And if this coincides with a presidential election, no matter what we say, there's always a chance that presidential election may turn up to be divisive, contentious, and so forth. So we wanted to have a one-time reset to separate the National Day festivities and activities from the election campaign for the president. And we specifically asked for permission, so there's nothing unconstitutional about it. It's not as if that we did it with a sleight of hand, and then do it. We actually said, and actually it's on record in the Hansard why we gave the reason for that. So there's just 2 points of clarification. The first one is no more than 3 months before the end of term, in order not for the government of the day, if you like in Singlish, to sabo the sitting president and make him a lame duck. And the second one is that there's a one-time reset, which we gave our reason for it, and Parliament supported it. And hence, we delay the writ of election for this round, and then we serve the writ of election after the National Day rally, and then now we have the election in the month of September.
Thank you, Minister, for that clarification. Then, may I respectfully request that you answer this question, SMS?
I volunteer.
Okay.
You can volunteer him to answer this question.
I volunteer him. He said no euphemisms. So in November last year, when the Prime Minister talked about the reforms and certainly about the reserved presidential election idea, he mentioned something to do with the image of Singapore as a multiracial society as part of the rationale for this. And I think that the Honourable Member of Parliament, Ms. Tin Pei Ling, also mentioned this. She said that there's an impression out there, certainly among, let's just say mainland Chinese people, that Singapore is a Chinese colony, that we should not be misunderstood that Singapore is a Chinese colony. To what extent, sir, do you think that, this idea of the reserved presidential election, and the first one, reserved for a Malay, is going to shape the image of Singapore outside of Singapore? How important is that strategically? Actually, Minister Chan, you want to weigh in? You're also welcome. But first to SMS.
Well, I think whoever the president is this time round, and whoever the president is in every future election, regardless of their race, they will have to play that role of the head of state in terms of international diplomacy. So the primary concern around how we choose our president has to be domestic. And the issues of race and the racially reserved elections are to serve our domestic concerns. Okay. Because every president will have to play that role internationally, regardless of their race. So I think it is primarily to serve a domestic issue, and the challenges that resulted in us requiring a racially reserved election are domestic. So I don't think we can say that it is all about what China thinks today or doesn't think today or thinks tomorrow. The international geopolitical situation is always going to be fluid and dynamic, and we're going to have to be responsive to that for this presidency as well as every other presidency in the future.
Okay. Minister Chan, you travel to China a lot. You represent Singapore there. What is the impression of us? Does this reserved presidential election have any impact on Singapore's self-image across the borders?
Let me be frank. From a foreign relations perspective, whether we have Chinese, Malay, Indian president, that's not the first thing that people look at Singapore and decide what to do with us. Okay. The first tenet of foreign relations is that unless we are relevant, nobody really cares too much about us. And I think that's just a fact of life. But having said that, all bigger countries and civilizations with longer history, often, when it's to their advantage, would like to cast Singapore in their image for their purpose. It's not something that is unique in this generation. It is something that happens in every generation, every moment in history. People use points to their advantage to further their own national agenda. For us, we always say that we are a multiracial country. Our concept of multiracialism is actually quite different from perhaps what many other countries also claim to be. Our concept of multiracialism is not one that decimates and write off the unique ingredients or elements of each race. Our concept of multiracialism is to build upon the strengths, the unique characteristics of each race for a common future. It's not to erase and make common, make bland all that each of the race bring with them to the table. Okay. Now this is very fundamental because it informs us on how we organize our society and how we structure our system. The goal is not to erase the unique characteristics of each race. When we say we build a multiracial community, the goal, I think as DPM Taman has also shared, is to build upon the foundations of each race for us to get the best of the many worlds that we inherit. And upon that many foundations, for us to seek a common future based on a set of common values and ethos. And that includes meritocracy and so forth. So this balance of meritocracy, building upon multiracialism, they are not either or. It is two concepts that we have to constantly find the balance. And that's why in today's discussion, we can get off on a tangent if we champion one without paying attention to the other. And it's always easy to champion one and take a purist approach. Intellectually, it's always easier. But the reality is that we live in a society that requires us to balance at least two non-mutually exclusive concepts in our mind in order to strengthen our society, in order to build a society that we can be proud of, that is unique and yet forward-looking, but most importantly, inclusive. So that's where I will leave here, and then we can carry on the discussion about the tension between two different concepts rather than just one.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Now it's over to you. Please, make your way to the mic, to the mics around the room, and feel free to pose your question. Just identify yourself and, fire away. You have 25 minutes, so take every opportunity to pose your question. Yes, Matthew, and then Sean.
Thank you. Minister, this was a question that came up from the last panel. Testing. Good. Minister, this was a question that came out from the last panel. And I think there were questions about the definition of race and the fact that this election is going to be a reserve election raises some of those issues in terms of the definition of what constitutes a Malay. And I think some on the panel discussed this hypothetical situation where someone who is, by all hereditary, he is Malay, is born as such, seen as such, but who is converted to becoming Christian. And of course, then the question is that will this be a problem, especially if the commission or the panel which is determining his eligibility turns him down based on the fact that he is not Muslim, but he's Christian? Do you see that this as being problematic for our overall notion of social cohesion and, of course, the whole notion about the reserved election? Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. We will take one more question, Sean.
Hi, Sean Danker, the Asian Observer. Now, we all know that the president is elected by popular vote, and theoretically, he is accountable to the people. But his actions are not immediately and automatically known by the public, which unfortunately gave rise to the open cynicism and apathy that Singaporeans are feeling towards the position. Could the Cabinet and the Office of the President consider greater transparency regarding, say, whether the President has been approached to provide his key to the reserves?
Sorry, Sean, say again. Can the President be?
Could the Cabinet and the Office of the President consider greater transparency regarding, say, whether the President has been approached to provide his key to the reserves?
Or whether Cabinet has approached President to unlock the reserves?
Yes, paraphrasing that way.
Oh.
Just greater transparency about the workings of the president, right?
So we
Okay.
at least the public is aware that yes, the president actually has an everyday role instead of, most people, if you read the comments online, everyone thinks that the president is just a lame duck.
Right. That doesn't do anything. Okay. Right. So, SMS, can you take the first question and then Minister, the second? Okay.
So I think the issue is really one of the balance between defining race and leaving the concept of race fluid and malleable or changeable over time.
Okay.
And I think I was here just for a few minutes just before we broke up for tea, and I did hear some of the comments, and there were sort of various examples, Indian mother and Malay father and etc. different religions. So it's very clear that we are concerned about how the boundaries between race are defined and whether or not there's room for that to shift in the future. If we took the view that the Constitution needs to provide absolute clarity at this point in time, in other words, someone had to sit down and define what made a Malay, what made an Indian, what made a Chinese, a Eurasian, and every other subgroup that makes up others. Well, firstly, the chances of us leaving the room with any agreement after more than a few days would be highly unlikely. But let's say we did so, it would mean then that there would be no opportunity to have a change without making a constitutional amendment. You'd have to go back to Parliament every single time. Every single time you had an intermarriage and a combination of intermarriage that you hadn't foreseen, you would have to pass a law and redefine whether this person was Malay enough or Indian enough and so on and so forth. The current setup, where you have a combination of a self-declaration and then an acceptance by the community, even though the definition of the racial identity is left ambiguous, the process is very, very clear. Which means that for any situation that you can dream of, 1/8 this and 1/16 that, and you were one religion and then at the age of 16 converted to another religion, is that enough? For whatever situation that you can think of, a decision by the committee at this point in time can be changed for a different individual 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 2 years from now, with the same circumstances, if the sentiments of the community have changed. So actually what you have is a mechanism for the process of selection of candidates to reflect what the community sentiment is. So it's not about the Constitution saying whether that example of the chap, I'm not sure if it was a man or a woman in the example, who was a Christian but were they Malay. If that was the sentiment of the community at this point in time and they were not accepted, then that is the intention of the mechanism. But the mechanism also leaves it open for someone in that same position to then be accepted at a later time when sentiments have changed. So to me, to have that fluidity over time is very, very important. It doesn't lock us in to say, you will never be in this category, you will always, a person from this community can never change and so on and so forth. The trade-off, unfortunately, is the example given about that particular individual having had a decision made about them. If you don't qualify as being Malay, it's seen as excluding that person. but that person is still eligible to stand in the open election. And that opportunity to always be eligible, there will always be a channel. You just are not eligible for this racially reserved election. Means that, well, you have the same chances in an open election as everybody else. So that's the way that I would say. It's not a legalistic answer, but I think from an aspirational point of view, I would rather we have a mechanism that leaves open the possibility of change over time. And if the Malay community changes its aspirations and its sense of what makes a Malay 5 years from now, there should be a way to reflect that in the choice of candidate without us having to go and have a potentially very divisive constitutional amendment. And the same for the Indian community and the same for the Chinese community. So I think that fluidity is something that I would support as being essential to the mechanism. I actually see it as a strength of our process, that we do have that ability to move over time.
Okay, thank you. SMS.
Let me add to what Janil has said. We are both not legal experts, but I just hope try to be commonsensical about this whole issue. The first point I would like to say is this. If you look back at the history of the Malay race over the last 700 years, its identity has definitely evolved. Race is different from religion. If you combine race and religion, you can say that the people in this part of the world called Southeast Asia had at various points in times adopted anything from Buddhism to Hinduism to Islam. But that's religion. So the very concept of race evolves. And the question is, how can we have a system that allows the very fluidity that Janil mentioned about? Now, why did we allow the community to decide for themselves as to who is deemed a Malay, rather than going for what you call a very definitive, restrictive, exclusive approach? Because it goes back to the rationale of what we are trying to do. What is the potential issue that we are trying to preempt? The potential issue that we are trying to preempt is, after 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, the community itself come up and feel that it has been deprived of an opportunity to be represented. If the community feels awkward that it is not being included, or if the community feels that the society is not being inclusive, so on and so forth. We have to deal with the sentiments of the community. Now, no amount of legal definition, DNA testing, and so on and so forth can deal with that. The community must come to terms as to who best represents them. And if the community accepts someone, be it Tanakau or whoever it might be, then who else outside the community would want to dispute that, and who else in the community want to dispute that? So it's a very commonsensical way to allow the community to decide for itself. So someone actually during this last 1-2 years says, can Chun Sing represent the Malay community? I mean, it's a serious question. And what do our rules say? Two things. Number one, will Chun Sing identify himself with the Malay community? That means I declare that I identify myself with the community. That means I identify with the community. Number two, the community must accept that I represent them. If I fulfill these two conditions, the first of which you may say that is within my control. The second of which must be decided by the community. If the community so decide that Chun Sing is a representative of the Malay community, then for the next 20, 30, however many years, the community cannot then say that nobody from my community has been represented, right? So it is a very, if you like, commonsensical way to resolve a rather tricky problem, right? So I don't think we need to get into the weeds of how you define one or the other by all kinds of legal or technical means. But the most important point is this: do you identify with the community? Does the community identify with you? If these two conditions are fulfilled, then we have basically solved a potentially tricky problem whereby one community feels that I have been left out in the whole process. So it is not a DNA question, it's not a legal question. All the things that we are trying to do is to support this very issue that we are trying to preempt. Now, can the community evolve the identity? Yes, it can, as Janil has mentioned. Right? So this is a practical way that we think we can manage some of these challenging issues. As to Sean's question, the second question, actually every time the cabinet approaches the president's office for any matter, whether to use the reserve or even to use the reserve as a guarantee, actually it is public knowledge. It is public knowledge. What were the few occasions that we have asked the president to use the reserves or to use the reserves as a guarantee in the last 10 to 15 years? You can recall the episodes. One, very obviously, was during the global financial crisis. There were two elements at that point in time. One was the resilience package. We actually had to take out more than $4 billion to help our industries and workers during that difficult point in time. But there was another decision. It required us to use our reserves to back up the banks and the financial system. And that was a substantially greater amount. Both of these decisions have to be made known to the President's Office, the Presidential Council, the Council of Presidential Advisors. So you can't do this thing quietly, that's not the mechanism. The mechanism is that it must be presented to the President's Office, and the President's Office must consult the CPAs. In more recent years, was another decision that required us to ask for the Presidential's consent. And that was the high-speed rail. Because when we built the high-speed rail, there was a guarantee. A guarantee in the event that the project doesn't come through, right? There are liabilities. The liabilities is huge. And there's a potential that we may have to use the reserves for that. And that, again, has to be presented to the President's Office. The President discuss with the CPAs, and they then make a recommendation. And in this particular case, President Tony Tan gave very practical advice on how to structure the guarantee. So it is not in any way opaque. You have to be totally transparent to this. But it has to be on both counts. When you use the reserves, and you potentially use the reserve because you have used it as a guarantee. So on both counts, you must make the decision public to the President and the CPA. Yeah.
Okay, so may I take the first question there, the lady in black, and then we'll just take 3 questions and try to answer quickly. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm Xiang Luan, TCA College, not representing any other body except myself. Just following up the question on the definition of race, it's meant to be kept fluid so that it can reflect the sentiments of the community along the process of time. But the question is, how do you decide based on the sentiment? How do you measure the sentiment and decide how the community views a certain candidate, whether he's Malay or he's Indian or otherwise? If we can't even decide among a community how we decide race. Okay, that's one thing. And the other thing is, are we sure that a community is homogeneous in their idea of, what constitutes Malayness? So if the community is not homogeneous, they come from different backgrounds and different definitions, then how in the end can we actually decide on something that would reflect the sentiment of the community?
All right, thank you very much. Got it, thank you. Over to the lady on the right.
Okay, Lily here. I'm just a citizen.
Lily.
Lily, yes. Okay, so I want to follow up with Minister Chan after your explanation about why these elections are coming about. I wanted to ask, since this panel is about the future, what's going to happen in the years following the election? How are you going to measure that this group of disenchanted people or the community that feels left out, they're now happier, everything's good. This is quite a bit about happiness and fairness. So what is the plan that the government has put in place about measuring that to say, yes, that was a great decision, or, oh no, we really didn't, we shouldn't have done that. That really was not a good thing. And how long is this going to last? I mean, in countries where affirmative action and Bumiputra laws and all that, you know that if it goes on and on and on, it's actually not very constructive for a society. So what is the government's plan for how to measure and assess this in the future? Is it at some point you're going to say, all right, enough, no more reserve elections? Or in the future elections, there is actually going to be really good efforts to bring other candidates so that you don't have to have a reserve election again.
Okay, thank you, Lily. Okay, Shobi at the back. Yes.
Shobi from Taupa. I actually waited for this question to come up, but it didn't, so I thought I should. Okay, basically I was just thinking, this being the first reserve election, a lot of people will actually be waiting to cast their votes. But at the same time, we all know that we went through a lot of process, hearings and so forth to actually come up with, to craft all the criteria needed for the candidates. So how to square this two? Again, we don't want to revisit this issue every now and then when there's a reserve election. So how to square this aspiration of the people and the criteria? Or is there a need to square this in the first place? Thanks.
There's something you're not talking about with regard to the criteria. You're making a judgment about the criteria, so why don't you explicitly say what you mean?
Well, for this election, we know that the two candidates, at least we know that two of the candidates may not meet the qualifications of this shareholders' equity. So that being the case, there can be a walkover. But do we want? But in the last election, we saw that it's still possible to contest on certain grounds. So perhaps there was some deliberation done there and then. So would the same be also done this time round? So a lot of queries will be surrounding that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shobi.
Thanks.
So over to SMS, and there's 3 questions. So can we wait for a minute? Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. By the way, whoever's running the timer, we end at 6:15. So why do we have 5 minutes on the clock?
It's a discount rate.
It's very stressful. Okay, first to SMS, then Minister. Yeah.
Any particular order or?
No.
No, just...
Yeah.
Well, the first was this issue of the definition of race. The whole point was that it is not specified externally. And I think that's the point that Minister Chan also made. Yes, it's not homogeneous. The committee has the opportunity to take soundings from across the whole of the committee. Sorry, let me say that again. The committee has the opportunity to take soundings from across the whole community that they represent. And it's not a single person's decision. It's not on a single point of data. That's the point, that it is not homogeneous. And there is some opportunity for deliberation, some opportunity for fluidity over time, and, frankly speaking, some opportunity for the committee to assert some community leadership. If the committee feels that there's a borderline case and could go one way or could go the other, then, well, it's a matter of leadership. Whether you say, well, I'll just go with the safe common denominator standard that we had previously, or do I take a risk and lean forward a little bit? Now, who should be making those decisions? And it certainly should come from within that racial or ethnic community. It shouldn't come from without. It shouldn't be externally imposed upon people. And who best to decide whether that community can carry this decision, but a group of leaders from that community. The second issue about measuring engagement, I just mentioned it from the point of view of onepeople.sg. We're constantly looking at this in the work that we do. We are engaging with ethnic groups, racial groups, religious groups, and discussing about how people feel engaged in the discourse and the narrative and the issues of national identity. So it's not just about when there's a racially reserved election. It's something that groups like ours are doing continually and write reports on it, do studies on it. For us, the measure of when we need to stop this, actually that's the whole point of the constitutional amendment with the sunset clause. That if there was an open election where a member of a minority race was elected without a racially reserved election, well, then automatically we've activated that sunset clause. We don't need to do anything more. That will demonstrate when we've arrived.
For some reason, Lily suggests that we have to make sure that there are more candidates that stand. So I'm not sure how she wanted to contrive that, but do you have any ideas?
Well, I think the whole, there's a little bit of, I don't want to say schizophrenia, but you have to make up your mind. Are you suggesting that the government should manipulate this to make everybody happy about the type of election that we have to have, or should we wait for people to step up? And of course, that's the way it should be, that you create the system, you create the process, but actually it's that individual making the choice to step forward and step up.
Then to cut to Shiobi's point, she was saying, but then the criteria, I think she wasn't too explicit, is probably set in such a way that makes it challenging to have many candidates. I know Min Shan had emphasized that in cutting the criteria at SHE 500 million, there are at least 2,000 possible candidates. Your point of view, sir?
Well, I think specifically you should not be asking for a lowering of the standards or a change in the standards because it's a racially reserved election. I mean, that goes against the principle of going for the minimum possible intervention and the point Chun Sing made about balancing meritocracy and multiculturalism. You would be swaying that balance in a different direction if we change the criteria. But I think that argument's been had several times over, and I think it's very clear why we're doing it.
Over to you, Minister Chan.
Okay, some quick additional points.
Yes, please.
First, a thing about who defines that, within the community the committee, who defines it? Actually, you have answered the question yourself, which is that the committee is not homogeneous. This is a tongue twister that I used to be able to do 25 times during the parliamentary speech without missing a bit. The community committee is actually a composite from the community itself. So the way to answer your question is to make sure that we don't have what you call, in your words, a homogeneous committee, and then you might have everybody of the same kind. Now, to give some confidence to how this works, actually this committee, minus the Chinese one, has worked for the last 25 years. Because every time we have a GRC election, this committee has to sit and decide. And I think they have thus far not disappointed us. They have given us rather very sensible recommendations. So I think the system works. On Lily's point, this is always something that the government has to struggle with in convincing our public on anything that we need to do. If we come up with a policy to preempt a problem that we think may happen, and the problem didn't happen, then is it because the problem never actually could have happened? Is it because the government, with its great foresight, have preempted the problem? Or is it we are just lucky and it has nothing to do with the problem and nor the policy? So it's not something that we can answer easily with matrices and so forth. But there are other non-quantitative, if you like, factors that you can see. It's a sense of the ground. It's a sense of the ground, a sense of the mood. Today, we all aspire to be beyond race.
Yes.
It is good, and we are very proud that all Singaporeans aspire to be beyond race. That's why we recite it every day as our national pledge, regardless of race, language, religion. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we are there. We always say that today we are nearer than yesterday, and I'm sure that tomorrow will be nearer than today. But that doesn't mean that I'm there. And if I am not there, and I accept that I'm not there, then what practical things do I have to do to get myself there closer, faster if possible, and yet at the same time do not ride roughshod over the many challenges that I have to deal with at this point in time, right? So what is the best outcome is exactly like you say. Under the hiatus trigger mechanism, if we naturally have an outcome where we do not need to trigger a reserved election forevermore in Singapore, we'll be very happy, right? But on the other hand, if for whatever reason, after another 25, 30 years, we find ourselves in the same situation, then are we better off having a mechanism to try to alleviate some of the issues that we are facing, or are we not? And that is a tough question. Are we better off putting in place the hiatus mechanism now, where we still have the political space to do it? Or do we wait for the problem to emerge and find ourselves maybe not having the chance to do it there and then? And if we look at the experiences of other countries, many have left it too little, too late. By the time that they want to act, they can't fix it anymore because the problem has grown so big. Right? Okay. So that is a very practical thing that we have to answer. On Shobi's question, is the criteria too strict? That is not, the correct question is the criteria too strict for all? Not whether it's a criteria too strict for a particular group. We cannot be making a rule where we, if you like, have a double handicap. And that's not what I think the Singaporeans want, and I don't think that's what neither the Indian nor the Malay communities want. We hold the same set of rules to the best extent that we have to fulfill our aspirations for a meritocratic system. We have a hiatus trigger mechanism to try to fulfill the multiracial aspirations that we have. But imagine if we have different rules for different races, all for the sake of multiracialism, without consideration for the meritocratic aspirations. I don't think the Singaporeans will accept that as well, right? So I can understand the Singaporeans' aspirations to say that we would like to see a contest and perhaps we would like to see more people there, but I think, more people contesting, but I don't think Singaporeans would like to see us having different rules for different races, because that would have shifted the balance, I think, too much just on multiracialism without balancing the considerations for meritocracy. That's my own sense of it. Okay. As to how many people will be able to stand or want to stand, how many people can stand is by the rules. How many people want to stand is not by the rules, it's by who wants to come forward and stand. And finally, what decisions the PEC makes, that's really beyond me to comment. I'm not in the PEC, right?
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, Aruna here. I understand that we have quoted the Constitution as to how we decide who is of a certain race, and we rely on the community, and the community then relies on a committee. This is a very dangerous game, because the committee, how is it elected? What is the criteria the community uses to select this committee? And these people tend to become gatekeepers, especially where religion is involved. I can give you two instances where committees using criteria eligible since the British colonial era, the Hindu Endowment Board and the Sikh Advisory Board. These their people have evolved, but their criteria for who sits in the committee still is within the confines of what was laid down in the British colonial era. In relevance to today's elections, does the MUIS have its own gatekeepers? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Bernard?
Hi, Bernard Tang from Evergrowth Capital Management.
Yeah.
I'm a patriot of Singapore, and I'm in my 40s, born in the 70s. So all my life, me and my peers have been grown up, and the younger generation in education, and then in the army, and then back in education. When the government say jump, you just say how high, you know? So Minister Chan, you have been trained as
I can't believe that, but okay, we'll take it. Really? So, okay, continue.
I'm sure the ministers have been in army and have been trained like that. So the policies in Singapore are guided, with progress in mind. And but there are occasions when these policies are done a tad bit iron-fisted. So internally it's done iron-fisted, but externally our image and our stance is friends to all,
Yeah.
Enemies to none.
Iron-fisted, did you say? It's not very clear up here, so you have to speak straight into the mic. Yeah.
Iron-fisted. Yeah, I did say that, iron-fisted. So with our current government embracing technology and tech disruption to the max, why not embrace tech disruption to include Singaporeans in decision-making for our policies, for Singaporeans by Singaporeans? So my fellow entrepreneur and investor who's my age group, Tan Min Liang of Razor, has taken up the challenge with Mr. PM Lee Hsien Loong to do a payment solution, right?
So how does it relate to the reserve presidential election?
So I'm just wondering, instead of creating a policy and then enforcing this as a Malay presidential election, and then after that coming out in the papers months or weeks later, and finally I'm invited here from the business delegate to have this forum to explain this whole shebangs. So, I mean, why not just do a reverse engineering and use technology to include younger generations or older generations in decision making?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tang. Next question, Eugene.
Eugene from SMU. I don't want to revisit the issue, but I think I have to. It relates to the question of, should religion play a role, in defining whether someone is a Malay or not? I think there's certainly a merit in saying that the community, because the president will have to come from that community in the reserved presidential election. But we must not forget that there are minorities within minority. And I think maybe the ministers may not be aware, that in our constitution, and this is not being legal, right? We all have the fundamental liberty of right to religion, right? That means choosing whatever religion you want, or not to have a religion at all, or to change your religion. My second question relates to the contest, right? So besides exercising the democratic choice, and I agree, Mr. Janil says that, we can't manipulate. But Mr. Nathan himself, in his memoirs, had said that, he was encouraged to run. And by all accounts, the first presidential election in 1993, the contest was also very much encouraged. So the question is, why is this time different, particularly when it relates to a reserved presidential election? And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the reserved presidential election. I know it's really too late, right? The deadline is passed, but I think we have missed an opportunity in trying to get Singaporeans to better understand what the reserved presidential election is and what it is not. Thank you.
What precisely, though?
No, because
the whole idea.
No, because you have people who think, Singaporeans who think that, the reserved presidential election is essentially reserved for people from that community, that the others are not going to vote. Then we have questions like, who is a Malay and all that, right? So I think we have missed a very valuable opportunity.
Okay.
I could go into specific, but I don't think time permits me, unless you want me to.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, thank you, Eugene. Over to Ambassador Zainal, and
Thank you, Gillian. Yeah. One of the things I remember about our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, is that he expressed this interest and this concern that the majority Singaporeans must always look after the interests of the minorities. And I think we've heard today the number of institutions created, GRCs, quotas for housing and all that. So this is one of the uniquely Singapore way of ensuring the minorities feel not marginalized, that they have a place, they have a role. But from what we heard today, in fact, it has brought about kind of worms. I don't know whether it's Pandora's box being opened, but I'm glad it has surfaced. There are a lot of issues, and one of the things which I worry most is that the very purpose of us having EP, while wanting to make everybody feel Singaporean, feels included, and feel part of Singapore, that it doesn't divide us. But we've heard today, there's a lot of division amongst the Malays, amongst non-Malays. So my question is, with all these concerns about the Pandora's box and the cancer worms and the issues, will it help avoiding these issues, these problems, by having a contest or not having a contest? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So gatekeeping, who gets to be in this committee, and then how will they view religion as well? That's one. Use of tech to engage younger people, and then, yeah. They're trying to decide who's going to take what, which question.
You take whichever one you're comfortable. I'll wrap up with it.
Yeah, okay. And S.R. Nathan saying, the late S.R. Nathan saying that he was encouraged to run. Why is it different this time? Weren't more people encouraged to run by the government? And finally, will having a contest actually cause division? Has this whole discussion really caused division? I actually wanted to pose that back to the questioner, Ambassador Zainal. Has this polarized? Just very quick responses, then after that, Minister, you'll wrap. Okay. Take whichever one you like.
Sure.
You get to volunteer.
Oh, yeah. For real this time.
For real.
I think the issue about MUIS, HEB, all the other bodies, actually, that highlights the difficulty. If these bodies within the community already have some difficulty at those issues of definition, at those issues of fluidity and change over time, how much more difficult would it be to impose this on the community from outside? I'm not in any of my remarks suggesting that this change over time or that these issues of national identity and racial identity or religious identity are in any way easy to settle. There is no country in the world, no society in the world, no religion nor ethnic group in the world that has dealt with this in a friction-free, happy-go-lucky, clap everybody on the back and walk out friends kind of way. It is always going to be a contentious, difficult, prickly, thorny issue. But if you try to impose this on people from outside their community, outside of their religious faith, outside of that sense of historical trust, how much more difficult will it be? So actually, I would say all your points are correct and highlights the need for our current approach and to strengthen our current approach, rather than try to impose this from an external majority point of view. The issue about technology, I mean, what you're basically asking for is governance by referenda. And there are political parties and there are places in the world where that has exactly happened. And I'm not aware that it has been a position of strength or an opportunity for productive discourse in terms of dealing with these most thorny issues. And there are some countries in the world where that is unfortunately playing out now. I would say Eugene made a point about the constitutional role of religion. It's not that I don't understand it, it's just I'm not sure that we are changing your constitutional liberty to have whatever religion you wish for. I'm not sure where Eugene is. He was,
Over there.
Okay, sorry, eyesight. Yeah, because just because you're not given that certificate doesn't require you to change your religion. You are not stopped from ascribing to the religion of your choice and practicing the faith of your choice. Neither does it completely preclude you from contesting a presidential election. It just means that you cannot contest that racially reserved one because of the need for the certificate. So I mean, I take your point that it is a prickly issue. I must say, I really would say I have no legal backing for my statement. This is just my understanding that the use of religion as a factor doesn't mean that you have to then alter your own religious practice or your stance on that religion. But I defer to your much greater expertise on this. The issue of encouraging candidates, I'm sure we should. I think it's not just an issue of the government encouraging, but if any electoral process, people who are able and competent and have both the attitude and the aptitude and the skill and the interest and the passion don't stand, then the electoral process isn't going to serve us all. It's something we all have to partake in. The opportunity to engage and educate Singaporeans about the nature of the presidential process. I hope that's what we've been trying to do since this idea was first mooted. And I don't know that it is something that necessarily excites a large number of people, but we are trying. We are trying very hard to go out and talk to people about this and engage people about it. But could we do more? We will have to do so, and we'll have to keep on doing so, I think, every time the opportunity arises. As for the last point, whether a contest or no contest, I don't know that it is something that we can make any choice or a decision at this point in the process. I mean, you know, the nominees are there, the process is there. We'll have to see what happens. I think every election, every electoral process, whether there is a vote exercise, whether it's 2 candidates, 3 candidates, 1 candidate, every electoral process is potentially divisive. And I think that's true for parliamentary democracy, it's true for presidential style elections. And always the issue is what happens day one, and how does the president or the elected members of parliament, the prime minister, how does the person who stood as a candidate in the process work and engage to serve the entire country? And I think whether it's contested or uncontested, that will still be true. That the people going through a contest or people not going through a contest will still have to demonstrate that they are a president for all of Singapore from the first day after. So I don't have an answer for specifically as to which process would be better.
Thank you, SMS. Over to you, Minister Chan. Your responses and also to wrap.
Sorry, sorry, I can't remember the name of the lady who asked the first question about who nominates the nominees. Okay.
She's from RSIS.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Basically, this question you can get into an infinite loop, which is that who nominates the nominees, and then who nominates the nominator, then you go on and go on, right? So I have just a very commonsensical approach to this, which is that you can have all the kinds of system, however elaborate you design the system. Man who makes the system, man corrupts the system. The key of the whole thing is that you need good people. How do you get good people, sensible people? Actually, it goes through the electoral process. We choose a government. We trust that the government we choose will make sensible decisions on choosing the correct people to be emplaced onto various roles and responsibilities. But we cannot have a system whereby we choose a government and then we have a parallel system to choose the set of people who run. Because in this case, you get into this infinite loop, you know. Who selects the selector to select the select? And then who select the... You can't answer that. But the crux of it is that Singaporeans need to make the choice. Who do you trust and emplace your trust in? Because when you selected that government, for the next 5 years, that government owes it to the people to make the correct choices and good decisions, good choices. If for whatever reasons the government of the day don't live up to the trust and trusted upon it, then at the next election, the people will vote the government out for failure to make the decision. But I'm okay with this system, but I will not be okay with a system whereby you select a government and then someone else have a parallel system to select the people, and so forth, because then you run into an infinite loop, which then begs the question, who bears the responsibility? So for us, it's very clear, right? So how have we practiced this system? You look at the last 25 years, the government nominated people onto the committee. They have made sensible decisions, and I think we are quite proud of what they have done, and that continues. On Bernard's question, yes, of course, we are using technology to try to govern better. This range from how we manage our traffic system to and so on and so forth. But I must caution against one particular strand of thought, which is that we can seemingly take a poll on what we want to do for every decision that we want to make. In fact, if you read the Economist magazine, not too long ago, they actually had a write-up about how the Europeans are using referendums for every single issue. And that's not necessarily the best way to govern. To govern, you not only have to take care of the here and now issues, you have to take care of the issues that may emerge in the future and may not have even emerged at this point in time. So there is always that sense of balance, that sense of perspective that you need in order to govern well. Technology can enable us to have a much better sense of what our people think and feel, but it is not a panacea to all the kinds of issues that we need to get a good ground feel of what we need now for our people and what we need for the future of our country. And in fact, one of the role of a government has always been, or one of the role of a good government has always been to balance the desire for the here and now that is always present in the public consciousness, balancing that with the deferred priorities or the future priorities that we have to think about in the future. It is the job of the government to think here and now and also think of the future. To the extent that technology can help us do it, I think we should tap it, but it will not be a case whereby everything can be decided just by polling people on what we want to do on specific issues. And I know you don't mean that. On Eugene's point, I'm also a bit lost. I don't think we have infringed on anybody's right to practice any religion. In fact, there's nothing to do with religion. In fact, this whole thing has to do with the committee deciding whether that person is a member of that community. It's silent on the religion as a factor. Encourage people to run. Actually, this is quite a cute question. On one end of the spectrum, we have people who believe that the government is omnipotent and we can say, thou shalt run, and you shall run. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have people that, why must the government tell the person to run? Right? In fact, the very suggestion that that person might have been asked, nominated, volunteered by the government to run, it immediately becomes a negative. Because some people belong to the school of thought that the president should be a check against a check and balance against the government. And so it cannot have any association with the government. So I leave it to you as to in which part of the spectrum you believe you are on, whether you believe that the government must well just volunteer the person to run, to the other one that you just leave it to the wisdom of the crowd to decide who wants to run. Okay, I leave it to you. The last thing about the Zainal's question is actually the crux of why we are here today. Actually, when we started this whole process, we wanted to balance that meritocracy with multiracialism. We want multiracialism to be an inclusive concept, right? And in fact, when we started this process and we went through the process, we had always wanted it to be an inclusive definition. And if you recall, in the recent weeks, how did it risk being hijacked by certain groups of people to make it an exclusive concept? That you need to ask that particular group of people, why do they want to make it an exclusive concept rather than an inclusive concept? Because what unites us is the inclusive concept and not the exclusive concept. So, well, we can't control everything that goes on, whether is it on the cyberspace or out there. And we can't deny that, yes, in such discussions, various perspectives will be put forth, and some of these perspectives will lead people down the path whereby people become more exclusive rather than inclusive. And that is a net negative for our country, right? But it is good that we have open discussions on where we are heading as a country. And if I may, with Gillian's permission to round up, I would just share some personal perspective on this whole process, something beyond this reserve election. First perspective I'd like to share with everyone is that we are a young country. We are a young country with rather unique characteristics, trying to build a nation with a set of common values, common ideals, but without necessarily a common past based on race, language, religion, ancestry, nor connections. As a young country, we have to evolve our systems to adapt to our circumstances. While we study the systems of other countries, we must apply those systems carefully, adapt those systems carefully to our local context. Not just only to meet the here and now requirements, but also if where possible, to anticipate, to preempt the challenges that might arise in the future. And I'll share something personal with you before we leave. How many of you in this hall today feels that the last 2 years debate on the presidential elections, the elected presidencies and the reserve presidential election, the hiatus trigger mechanism. How many of you in this hall feel that the PAP, the government of the day, has paid and will pay a political price for this? How many of you think that the government of the day has and will pay a political price for this? The majority of you, right? So, why did we do this? You may not think very much of the intelligence of the current leadership and think that, even if you don't think that they are the smartest people on earth, maybe we can agree at least they are not stupid, right? I mean, jokes aside. Then I ask you, if you can see that we are going to pay a political price for this, then why do we do it? If you form the government, will you do it? Let me suggest this. If we are all good politicians, we won't do it, and we shouldn't do it. No good politicians will sacrifice his political capital for a problem that may arise in future generations. Most politicians in the world will try to preserve their political capital for themselves to manage their current problems. So what we have not answered is still, why did we do this? I know there are many conspiracy theories out there. If it's for any of those conspiracy theories that you might have heard, then why do we pay the political price? Or why are we prepared to pay the political price to do this? Is it for those conspiracy theories? Or is it for something else? Let me be frank with you. For every conspiracy theory that you heard out there, I have a very good answer for you, a very simple answer for you. If it has to do with an individual, then there are many other ways. First of all, there's no one individual that is confirmed a winner in any election. No one goes into an election thinking that I will have a 100% chance of winning, and therefore everybody must do all kinds of things to block me. If it's for political gain, then surely we are not achieving it as you have rightly pointed out. I'll share this real story with you. We had a conversation with PM Lee. We asked ourselves, PM, do we need to do this now? Because just as you, we have anticipated that it will be a hard journey to convince people, and we will pay the political price, at least in the short term. PM Lee's answer will forever be etched in my mind. And that distinguished a politician from a political leader. His answer was simply this. Yes, we are likely to pay a political price. Yes, we may not have a problem here and now. But what if we have a problem 20, 30 years from now? Will the fourth, fifth, sixth generation have the liberty, the luxury of time and space for them to put in place a system? he took it upon himself as the political leader to put in place a system to preempt potential issues from arising in the future for the country. Not for himself, not for his political capital, always thinking for the country first, that he's prepared to pay the political price. And we are prepared to pay the political price because we think the future of our country is much more important than any political capital that we may have for this generation. So you are right. It's a very difficult decision. It has a lot of debate. But we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our future generations to put in place systems to preempt issues. If the issues don't arise in the future, as one of you have suggested, we're very happy, we're very proud. And maybe we have done our little bit for the future of Singapore to be better. But we will not be able to face the future generations if we have not done what we can within our means to establish that foundation for them to be even more successful than us. So it's not an easy thing. And constantly, for this government that I can speak of, we are constantly looking at what are the problems that may emerge in the next 10, 20, 30 years, where we can let us work hard, mobilize our people to support the difficult decisions, to put in place the systems for the future while managing the current. That is a lesson that PM Lee taught me, the difference between being a politician and being a political leader. So I'll leave you with that. Last but not least, I go back to where I started off with. We have two sets of ideals that we want to uphold. Meritocracy, that unites us regardless of race, language, and religion, ancestry, nor connection. That so long as each and every Singaporean is capable and willing to work hard, each and every Singaporean will be given the best support to fulfill his or her potential. That is what defines Singapore. Multiracialism, our brand of multiracialism is one that builds on the components' strengths and not to whitewash, homogenize everybody. In these two challenging aspirations, we as Singaporeans must find our way forward. It is a dereliction of duty on our part if we do not think hard about such issues, or if we just blindly try to copy a system from somewhere else. Because we owe it to the future generations to think hard how we can establish those foundations for them to do better than us. So thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the best in our onward journey together to find and build stronger, more robust systems for the future generations of Singaporeans. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Chan and SMS Puthucheary. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Let me just share with you a few points that I take away today. I think as we think about the reserve presidential election, it is a little bit difficult, but really to try to imagine it as a system which includes, which seeks to include. And I think even in the very protracted but very important discussion about who gets to qualify even under the race, I think the emphasis has been to keep things as fluid as possible in order to include diversity. And to the point about the gatekeepers, if I may just add one point, which is if there is division or, unhappiness, then the question really is why not have a conversation intra-community about who those community leaders should be, right? Then also, I think that we want to recognize the point that Dr. Noor Sharil made earlier, that the conversation has actually been one that is helpful. I think his point of view is that as we talk about that diversity and the diversity of views, it is helpful because it should take us to a point of greater understanding. Next point is that indeed, we make no bones about it, we have an activist state that, as Minister Chun, you've explained, seeks to preempt problems. So when I started off today, I said, why do it now? And your answer is really, now is better when there's political space to do it than to wait till the problem emerges. And I think Minister Shan also highlighted that we may think that there are no problems, but really through the surveys, we are not yet post-racial. And finally, that we look to the future, whether there is a contest or not. You have all disavowed the possibility of contriving a contest. I think the previous panel also said that it's best left to the PEC, but we look forward to what unfolds on September 13. Please allow us at IPS to wish you a very good evening, but also, a very rich moment in time in our nation's history as we consider how we want to go forward as a meritocratic and multiracial nation. Thank you, and we wish you well. Yes. Please help us fill in your evaluation forms, because this will help us shape future events and also ensure that we have support for future events like this. Thank you.